Good morning, everyone. Happy last day of the conference. I'm so happy to see such a big room of energized people. My name is Bergen Cooper. I'm the Director of Policy Research at the Center for Health and Gender Equity Change in Washington, D.C. I am stepping in today for Sarah Sipple, the President of Change, who couldn't be here to moderate. But, you know, we're going to have so much more clapping and excitement than that room. I'm very excited about the data, but now I'm also really excited about showing them up. So just get jazzed. As I said, this is a really exciting panel. The Expanded Mexico City Policy, or Protecting Life and Global Health Assistance, or the Global Gag Rule, so many names for this policy that we're talking about today. Oh, God. So it's very exciting to see some of the early impacts of the policy. And by exciting, I mean devastating. So to get us started, what we're going to do is we're going to hear from all of our panelists, and then we will have Q&A from you. You've been here all week. You know how it works. You line up at the mic. We take 3 questions at a time, and then we end on time. We're going to start with Jen Cates. Jen is the Vice President of Director Global Health and HIV Policy at Kaiser Family Foundation.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. And as we said, we will try to block out that noise over there and focus on the topic at hand, which is the Mexico City policy and its impact on HIV and related areas. For this, I'm going to talk about findings from our new study where we looked at estimating the impact on NGOs and funding. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So just briefly on the background, I'm not going to go through all of this, but the main point, and I think everyone here probably knows this by now, but the prior policy, when it has been in effect, required foreign NGOs to certify that they would not perform or actively promote abortion as a method of family planning using funds from any source as a condition of receiving U.S. family planning assistance. This policy was expanded by President Trump when he first announced it on January 23, 2017, to apply to almost all U.S. global health bilateral assistance. By our estimates, that's about $7.4 billion in fiscal year 2018, to the extent that that funding ultimately is provided to a foreign NGO. And that includes PEPFAR as well. So we sought to estimate the number of NGO recipients of PEPFAR funding who could be subject to the policy, as well as the amount of funding they receive. To do so, we analyzed data from the U.S. government, from USAID. We looked at the most recent 3-year period when we did the study, which was 2013 to 2015. We identified NGO prime recipients of bilateral HIV assistance, so bilateral PEPFAR money, as a proxy for the current number of NGOs that might be subject to the policy. And by that I mean would likely be required to make a decision, will I comply with this policy and get USG funding, or will I not comply with the policy and forego all of the USG funding from, in global health that I could get? We calculated the amount of funding and the number of countries these NGOs worked in, and then we stratified those countries into 2 groups. One, those that allow for legal abortion, and at least one case not permissible under the Mexico City policy. So we wanted to look at those countries where an NGO might be operating with U.S. government, that make the choice about whether or not they're going to accept U.S. government money in a country where abortion was legal, but the activities would not be permitted if they wanted to accept USG funding, and those countries that did not allow abortion in any case beyond the Mexico City policy. Our bottom line finding is that we identified 470 foreign NGO prime recipients of PEPFAR funding in that period, of almost $900 million. So these are prime recipients, meaning that they received funding directly from the U.S. government for PEPFAR. And then they may pass that down to another entity as well, and I'll get into that. But these, are, as a proxy, that would mean somewhere on the order of 470, maybe more, prime recipients, foreign NGO prime recipients of USG funding would have to make this decision. Would they want to accept U.S. government money and comply with the policy or not? We also know that the way that U.S. government funding flows, it flows often to a U.S. NGO, which are not subject to the policy, or to some other entity. And if it's a U.S. NGO, that U.S. NGO under the policy has to ensure that any foreign NGO subrecipients are in compliance. And from our other analysis that we've done, many, many more foreign NGOs are reached this way as subrecipients. So we identified 264 U.S. NGO prime recipients, accounting for about over $5 billion in funding, and any subrecipients that they have, so any money that they then provide in a grant to a foreign NGO, they would have to monitor compliance with the policy. We looked at the number of countries that these NGOs reached, and we identified about 60. And in 36 of these countries, abortion is legal, in at least one case not permissible under the Mexico City policy. And by that I mean, for example, many of these countries allow for legal abortion in the case of fetal impairment. The Mexico City policy does not permit that. So it would be a case where it's legal under the country's law for a woman to seek an abortion in that circumstance. But if an NGO was going to provide that service or talk about that service, they would not be able to accept USG funding to do it. This was a brief snapshot of the analysis. I think there are many other questions that those of us on the panel and elsewhere are looking to answer and that are hard to answer. The biggest one, I think, that is a challenge is really identifying these subrecipients of U.S. government funding. There's no single data set that's available to really trace that line of funding down from a prime recipient all the way down to all the subrecipients, yet we know that there's probably at least twice as many subrecipient foreign NGOs. So that's a big question. We don't know yet how much funding is ultimately therefore provided to foreign NGOs. We don't know how many foreign NGOs are providing services that are in conflict with the Mexico City policy and would have to discontinue those services if they wanted to comply, or how many will choose not to. We don't know yet, although we're starting to hear data on this, and I think the other panelists will speak to the early impact that we're seeing at the country and sub-regional level, particularly for certain populations. But one thing I do want to flag, PEPFAR and the U.S. government more generally are looking to increase the share of funding that goes to local providers, local implementers, foreign NGOs, those who work and are part of a country's infrastructure to create sustainability. So we don't know how that move, which I think is an important one for creating sustainability and country ownership and models that will work over time, could come into conflict with this policy, where those same NGOs will be required to make a decision about do they accept that funding or not. So in conclusion, the expansion of the Mexico City policy to encompass almost all U.S. bilateral global health assistance, including PEPFAR, does greatly expand its reach. But a key barrier to assessing the impact is identifying subrecipients, foreign NGO subrecipients. Even without these data, our analysis indicates that the expanded policy will likely affect hundreds of NGO recipients of PEPFAR support who will at least have to certify whether they will comply or make a decision about whether they will comply. And we'll hear more about what that decision-making process is and how challenging it is for organizations to disclose what they decide. Ultimately, however, it's still too early to know the impact of the policy on the ground. When the policy was last in place under the George W. Bush administration, it took at least 2 or 3 years, if not longer, to identify health impacts on the ground of a policy. So I think one of the take-home messages is we still have to find ways to assess this, even though we know that identifying immediate gaps is critical. Understanding the longer-term impacts is going to take a while. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Jen. I think some of the outstanding questions that you brought up are really critical for everyone on the panel and in the room to engage with, and I look forward to Q&A. And I just feel like I'm going to task everyone in the room for taking that up in their own work. So we're going to move on. Chloe Cooney, I'm going to ask you to come up. Chloe is the Senior Director of Global Advocacy at Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Planned Parenthood Global, Planned Parenthood Action Fund. That's a lot of work, Chloe.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And just to kind of give you a sense of who I am and that work, Planned Parenthood Federation of America is a leading sexual and reproductive health provider and advocate in the U.S., where we have 12 million supporters across the country. And through our international arm, Planned Parenthood Global, we work in 12 countries in Africa and Latin America, and we support over 100 local organizations with technical assistance and financial support in advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights in their communities. And Planned Parenthood Global has not received U.S. government funding since the Mexico City policy was first put in place by Ronald Reagan. But that's not to say we're not impacted by the policy. We're feeling its effects keenly through the partners that we support and through the larger International Planned Parenthood Federation family, which has lost significant resources as a result of this policy. And we're being relied upon by many of our partners to help navigate this new landscape. So it's through this perspective, as an organization working closely with impacted partners and communities but not directly losing resources, that we're able to study the effects of the policy and that it's having globally. Additionally, we're working with Columbia University on a multi-year study of the policy's effects in Kenya, which is underway now. And over this week, we've been investigating the impact of the policy on the HIV community, especially as it's applying to this funding stream for the first time. And since arriving at this conference, we've had over 150 conversations with stakeholders in the broader sexual and reproductive health and rights and HIV fields. These have included one-on-one interviews and small group discussions through a major workshop we held at this conference. So as we approach the impact of the policy now, I do want to pause and say what past data has shown. The principal impact of this policy in the past was that contraceptive access declined as a consequence of the providers that offered that services being disqualified. And as a consequence of that, unintended pregnancy rates increased, as did unsafe abortions. And this was when the policy applied to U.S. international family planning funds and not the broader global health assistance that we're seeing today. In fact, a peer-reviewed study by Stanford University researchers that was released in 2011 suggests a strong link between the imposition of the global gag rule under George W. Bush and an increase in the rate of abortions in the countries most affected by the policies. So I am going to move ahead to talk about the findings we're now seeing in this policy, and I'll just say that I have no conflicts of interest to declare. But there's two main findings I want to lift up at this stage from our collective work over the last 18 months and at this conference. The first is that some of the greatest harms of the global gag rule will not be measurable at a broad population or national level until it's too late to reverse course. And the second finding is that a significant impact we're seeing is evidence of the stigma the policy operationalizes. I know they're not applauding for that. The stigma itself is a harm of the policy, especially as it interferes with sexual health, but it's also a means by which the policy hides its effects. So, in other words, the nature of the global gag rule is that it hides the very harm it creates. And consequently, the global health community, and especially the HIV community, needs to pay very careful attention to organizational and community level impact that's starting to surface, and then respond accordingly. And I want to just make a note about stigma in both the HIV and reproductive health spaces. In the history of the HIV response, we know well that stigma is our enemy. It contributes to risk, it affects health-seeking behavior, it affects the response that people receive when they seek care and treatment that they need and that they deserve. And stigma is also one of the greatest challenges in reproductive health, especially, but not only around safe abortion. Stigma limits access to contraception, to sexual health information, and ultimately drives rates of unintended pregnancy, unsafe abortion, and maternal mortality. So the global gag rule is exponentially compounding the stigma and the effects of it in both of these sectors. So I want to talk about a few ways that stigma operates through this policy. There's an immense stigma in talking about the policy from the start. And I want to highlight a quote from an East African partner we work with who was reluctant to have a conversation with us about the global gag rule. And I'm going to read it here. I know there are many partners who would want to get out and speak on what this is doing, but we have an unsupportive environment. The space to be able to talk safely does not exist. There could be partners and many others who would confidently sit and talk about the challenges, but I don't think that we feel comfortable that we can speak. And this was shared by an organization that had a 40% funding reduction caused by the global gag rule. So in the workshop we held this week, many organizations expressed similar fears in their communities from even sharing their decision about whether they would sign the policy. And that undermines the ability to not only track impact, but also to address the potential service disruptions. And I think an indicator of the stigma is also the fact that most organizations refuse to share their experiences publicly and request anonymity in conversations. I think it's also important to note that the U.S. government's assessment of the policy is itself contributing to silencing of the impacts. The review they released earlier this year was structurally inadequate. It looked at a period of time when little new funding was dispersed and analyzed only prime grantees, the majority of which are U.S.-based and thus not required to sign on to the policy. And on top of this, I think there's sort of basic structural issues around the way foreign assistance operates that compounds this. I've spoken to several U.S.-based implementing organizations, even those who publicly oppose the policy, who still refuse to cite examples of service disruptions or other places where programs have been weakened as a result of it. And this is just because of organizational incentive to market successes, not highlight weaknesses, but it, again, compounds our ability to understand the effect we're seeing. One other way stigma is operating that I think is important to lift up at this stage is confusion over the policy, which is exacerbated by the stigma. Every organization we have spoken to expresses widespread confusion. And a major theme we've observed is both organizations and even U.S. government officials believing that the policy prohibits broader services than it does. A real concern, therefore, is over-implementation. As an example, we spoke to a partner who, again, requests anonymity, who's working in Latin America, who was told by a U.S. government official that any family planning services were prohibited as a condition of signing the policy, which is clearly not the case. And this type of confusion was not unique and is consistent in every interview we've conducted. So confusion creates harmful urgency as well. A Mozambique partner described being given only 2 business days notice to decide whether they would sign the policy or not, a time frame that would not enable any organization to make a reasonable determination. So these are just a few examples of the way stigma is operating that I wanted to lift up, but I think these, all of this we believe will have some long-term impacts, and I want to highlight 2 areas that we're seeing the early signs of that happening. The first is the ability to reach key populations, which are so vital in the fight against HIV. This week we heard from Planned Parenthood of Zambia, who lost PEPFAR funding to provide HIV prevention to key populations. They noted that no other partner in the consortium is able to replace that work. And this kind of service disruption is of great concern, particularly for those who are already marginalized and are losing the trusted provider that they know and may not be willing to go to another provider. In many cases, it's the only provider who is able to reach those populations. And so communities were especially concerned about reducing health access are adolescent girls and young women, sex workers, LGBTI communities, and several others. The second long-term impact I want to lift up at this stage we're seeing early signs of is the weakening strength of the civil society sector. And as we know, the civil society sector is critical to the global health response, especially as we move forward towards sustainability and country ownership. It's national advocates who are holding their governments accountable for the health investments and an important piece of the puzzle for sustaining global health programs. Yet in interviews, we're seeing alarming trends around the ability to organize in coalition as a result of this policy. Across the board, we hear stories of advocacy coalitions disbanding and or organizations no longer communicating with one another on the basis of those who are not signing the policy versus those who are. For example, a partner we work with in Uganda who works on maternal health advocacy has lost U.S. government funding for that work, and the Maternal Health Coalition is losing membership over this policy. This type of disruption was reflected in numerous interviews this week and in our work over the last 18 months, signifying a very wide effect. And it's an issue that I don't think is going to come across in most of the studies we're seeing. So together, the effects of the policy stand to greatly undermine the global fight against HIV and the health outcomes of the communities that we're hoping to serve. So looking ahead, I want to just reiterate our findings. Some of the greatest harms of the global gag rule will not be measurable on a broad population or national level until it is too late to reverse course. So we can't wait for that. A significant impact we're seeing evidence of now is the stigma the policy operationalizes. The stigma itself is a harm of the policy, especially as it interferes with sexual health, but it's also a means by which the policy hides its effects. I'm going to pause for a moment before I get to the advocacy agenda because I don't want you to miss it. But in the spirit of advocacy, I think it's important to note the speech effects that this policy has and the suppression of the activism we celebrate here at this conference. I think there. Okay. So we have an advocacy agenda, and I think that many groups in this room and at this conference have put together and endorsed, and it's a call to action coming out of this conference. The U.S. government should end the policy, but in the meantime, it should invest in evidence-based programs and policies, and it should work hard to combat over-implementation, and it should better monitor the impacts of the policy while it's in place. Non-U.S. country governments should reform laws and policies to expand comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and HIV services. It should allocate domestic resources to support comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and HIV services, and it should end criminal penalty, or they, should end criminal penalties associated with the free exercise and full enjoyment of sexual and reproductive rights and the expression of gender identity. And the donor community should invest in grassroots organizations, especially those focused on marginalized communities, fund civil society spaces for coalition building, networking, and joint strategizing, and provide direct support to organizations who have lost funding as a result of the policy and otherwise. And I would just say for everyone in this room, a takeaway from me at this conference is that we all have a role to play, because the chilling effect of this policy means everywhere that we're fighting and advocating for sexual and reproductive health and rights and HIV is a step towards combating the effects of this policy. So thanks to everyone for their work.
Thank you, Chloe. This is a fun conference, right? Chloe, thank you so much, and really thank you for speaking up as the sound came up. And you know, Jen spoke a little bit about how it was 2 to 3 years before we saw some of the health impacts under past iterations of the policy, and then we have Chloe come up and show us that we're able to see impacts right away in different ways, and it's so important that we are documenting, measuring, and sharing that information. So Louisa, I'm going to hand it over to you. I would recommend leaning into the mic during this time of the presentation. Louisa Orza is the Gender Technical Lead at the HIV/AIDS Alliance. Louisa?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to present. My name is Louisa Orza. I'm from the International HIV and AIDS Alliance, and I'm going to speak to our study, The Mexico City Policy, a Model of Disintegration. There are no conflicts of interest to declare. Just before I start, I'd like to share an update about the scope and focus of the study. We began the work in Ethiopia and Zimbabwe, but it became apparent that we were in danger of duplicating work that others were already undertaking or close to finalizing in those countries, and that there would be significant overlap. We therefore changed the country focus to Cambodia and Malawi, where partners were also expressing concerns about the impact of the Mexico City policy. This has inevitably meant that the study has suffered, but also in some ways benefited from some delays, including in the cleaning and corroborating of data from the first phase of the study. With that, the trends that I'm going to speak to today remain very much in the realm of characterizing the study and presenting a working hypothesis that we will be exploring in more depth as we move into the qualitative phase of the work. So the research is led by WATIPA and supported by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. Why did we commission the study? The Alliance, along with many other partners involved in the global HIV response, has expressed grave concern for what the expanded global gag rule could mean for the health and rights of key populations affected by HIV, including people living with HIV, men who have sex with men, transgender people, sex workers, and people who use drugs. Experience across the Alliance's partnership of 32 independent organizations includes direct loss of funding to both HIV and SRHR organizations or programming, including programming for key populations. Indirect loss of funding and capacity through burdensome admin, confusion, and reallocation of resources. Overextension of the global gag rule resulting in cessation of sexual and reproductive health services, including services which are not covered by the standard provisions of the Mexico City policy. Siloing of sexual and reproductive health and rights and HIV services, and silencing of civil society to advocate for safe abortion access. And there's also a really strongly held perception that there's a weakening of national civil society, as well as, of course, lost opportunity cost. Sorry. So it's still too soon to understand the full impact of the Mexico City policy. However, the study aims to document, analyze, and forecast the impact of the policy on integrated HIV and SRHR services, with a particular focus on the implications for people living with and most affected by HIV, including sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender people, and people who use drugs. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to run through all of the study aims and objectives. So we're adopting a site-specific approach for the first phase of the work. This involves quantitative analysis conducted using service-level site-specific data, client referral pathways data, and where available, budget or funding streams for the specific sites. The projections beyond site level would have an associated caveat that the results are not representative and that there may be important variations in other areas due to the specific dynamics of different sites, regional contexts, personnel and communities. However, the strength of the site-specific analysis would enable a series of projections and extrapolations that may highlight implications of the Mexico City policy on economic and health at the national level in different indicative contexts. The in-depth nature of the qualitative field study that will follow will allow for indicative examples and stories to emerge that can explain or illuminate trends emerging from the quantitative data at site level. So in Malawi, we're looking at 2 sites, Blantyre and Manguchi. We're looking specifically at referrals from drop-in centres for sex workers and referrals from drop-in centres for men who have sex with men. And in Cambodia, the sites we're looking at are in Phnom Penh and Battambang, and we're looking at referral pathways for all 4 key populations and service statistics. The next 3 slides characterize the service models used by the NGOs that the study team is working with vis-à-vis provision of HIV and STI testing and care services and integrated sexual and reproductive health services, mainly family planning. And where available, we look at emerging trends. I want to reiterate that we have as yet quite a limited quantitative information from the field. And in some cases, the data that we've obtained still needs to be cleaned and corroborated. So we do not propose at this stage to draw definitive conclusions from these data. Rather, they inform the key contextual questions and hypotheses of the next phase of the work, and that phase will build on. So looking first at the situation in Malawi, we're focusing on 2 organizations, one working with female sex workers, which is represented on the slide here. Through community outreach managed by partnering NGOs, referrals are made from hotspots to drop-in centres or public government health facilities. For this organisation in particular, the drop-in centres for sex workers were started in 2016. Data available to date indicates successful expansion of outreach, referral, and HIV and STI testing, treatment and care services from January 2017 to May 2018. In addition, there has been a decrease in first-time HIV testers and an increase in repeat testers over this period. This is an indication that the population of reachable female sex workers is becoming saturated, i.e. that the model is successful. In regards to family planning, there's been an increase in family planning referrals at this site from January 2017 to May 2018, according to the available data. The other organisation that the study team is working with in Malawi provides services for men who have sex with men. It's a very similar model. The services refer men who have sex with men to key population-friendly services, which then provide STI screening, HIV testing services, and information about sexual and reproductive health. The data set we have from this site is very small, and we're still working with the partner to corroborate and accurately interpret it. However, there has been a decrease in referrals from January 2017 to May 2018, which we're trying to understand. Again, during the in-country qualitative work, it will be a key opportunity to better understand whether there is any disruption to the service model, and if so, whether this is attributable to the Mexico City policy, and what ultimately the impact on individuals' ability to access services may be. Moving to Cambodia, we focus on an organisation that works with sex workers, transgender individuals, men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs, and people living with and most affected by HIV. As in Malawi, community outreach workers engage key populations in the community. In some cases, on-the-spot testing occurs in the field. They're then referred either to key population-specific services or drop-in centres, or to public facilities. Looking at the left-hand branch, is it left? Yeah. The Cambodian organisation then here provides on-the-spot testing, SRHR information and referrals. Services include syphilis testing, HIV testing services, family planning information and advice, and referrals for confirmatory testing. Looking at the right-hand side, they also prefer referrals to community health clinics and drop-in centres, as well as referrals to other family health or local clinics. Preliminary analysis indicates that the number of family planning referrals was lower than in the previous few years, and significantly lower than the numbers of HIV or STI referrals in 2017. As yet, we do not know the reason for this, but again, we'll be following up in the qualitative part of the study with an in-depth, a more in-depth analysis. We also see here that on the left-hand side of the study that following the Mexico City policy, at least one family planning counsellor was no longer able to be on the staff of the organisation. And again, we need to look more carefully into the reasons for that, and whether any measures were taken to substitute that person's role. So the above narratives provide preliminary insight into 3 specific organisations working successfully to deliver HIV and SRHR services to key populations in different contexts. And we are finding that it's going to be very interesting to explore further the impact of the MCP in these situations. As mentioned, the next stage of the work will be to continue to work with quantitative site-level data and to layer in a qualitative field study which will allow us to delve into the intricacies of these context-specific insights. Working hypotheses for the next phase of the work are that in some locations there will be a reduction in access to HIV prevention, testing and treatment services caused by the disintegration of HIV and SRHR services. That the health of people from key and vulnerable populations may be jeopardized by restrictions to the entire package of services they can receive, especially in key population friendly facilities, or trusted facilities. That advocacy efforts to maintain or liberalize laws which allow access to safe abortion will be stifled due to confusion, uncertainty, and fragmentation of civil society. However, we also hope and believe that we will see examples of civil society resilience, partnership, and solidarity. And I actually think that the particular organisations in case that we're working with, the very fact that they're engaging with this study is in fact a sign of that resilience. Thank you so much.
Louisa, thank you so much. We had Chloe talking about impacts on key populations and other vulnerable populations, and it's really wonderful to hear about your research, and I look forward to hearing the results of some of the qualitative work. So now we are going to head over to our friend Brian. Brian Honerman is the Deputy Director of Public Policy at AMFAR, the Foundation for AIDS Research.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm going to talk today about HIV providers in the context of the expanded Mexico City policy, also known now as the Protecting Life and Global Health Assistance policy. No conflicts of interest to declare. So I'm just going to touch quickly on a couple of the basic provisions of the policy and then talk about one new provision that was added to the policy and how it affects HIV providers going forward. So what the policy really is a speech restriction, and it says that foreign NGOs may not, while receiving U.S. government assistance, perform or actively promote abortion as a method of family planning. This, when it was expanded, now includes PEPFAR, as well as maternal and child health programming, as well as the traditional family planning and reproductive health programming. This includes, obviously, foreign NGOs, foreign faith-based organizations, as well as foreign private corporations and entities. It excludes multilateral organizations such as the Global Fund, Gavi, and UNAIDS. It excludes foreign governments, so ministries of health, departments of health, etc. And then it also excludes parastatals, including public universities, and you can see the definition of parastatal in USAID's glossary of terms there. So active promotion of abortion as a method of family planning means counseling on the existence of abortion as a method of family planning, counseling on the risks and benefits of abortion as a method of family planning, referring for abortions as a method of family planning, as well as other restrictions that aren't as particularly relevant to this discussion, but lobbying and advocating for expansion of abortion as a method of family planning in law. I keep reiterating abortion as a method of family planning because the definition is not really what most people would really consider. The definition provided in the policy is when it is for the purpose of spacing births, and specifically includes abortions for the physical and mental health of the woman, and abortions due to fetal abnormalities. You are expressly not allowed to speak about those. The exceptions that are allowed to be spoken about are rape, incest, and life endangerment. Those are the only exceptions for which you cannot, or for which you can continue to counsel and refer and provide. As I said, there was one provision that was added when the policy was expanded, and it is what we call the affirmative defense. Otherwise, the text of the Mexico City policy and the Protecting Life and Global Health Assistance policy are the same, other than the accounts to which it applies. And what the affirmative defense says is where local law requires healthcare providers to continue to counsel and refer as part of informed consent law, they can continue to counsel and refer for abortion as a method of family planning, and it will not be considered a violation of the policy. And the actual text is there. So what that means is informed consent still matters. And so I'm going to take the rest of this to really talk about a framework for how to assess whether this applies in a given country. So this is a flow chart we put together that really walks you through sort of the legal process of assessing it. At the top, you assess abortion legality. These are countries that receive global health assistance funding and where abortion is more liberal than allowed under the policy. Those in yellow are ones that have liberalization in terms of things like physical and mental health of the woman, or for fetal abnormalities. Those in green are the countries where abortion upon request is available. So then you would look at assessing, assuming you're in one of those countries, you would then assess the constitutional, statutory, case law, and professional ethical guidelines that talk about informed consent and whether specifically informed consent requires that women and patients be advised of all their treatment options that are available. I'm going to use the example of South Africa for part of this, or for this next stage. South Africa, as people know, has a very progressive constitution. There are two sections of the South African Constitution that specifically protect a woman's right to reproductive choice. The first is in Section 12, which deals with freedom and security of the person, and states that everyone has the right to bodily and psychological integrity, which includes the right to make decisions concerning reproduction. And to quote the South African Constitutional Court in talking about this, conspicuously, it is the decision that is protected, not any particular choice. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as we go forward. Section 27 of the Constitution then protects the right to access to health care, including reproductive health care, as well as the right not to be refused emergency medical treatment. Implementing legislation, initially in 1996, South Africa passed the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act, which also partially led to modification of the Mexico City policy dealing with what's called the passive referral. And then there's the National Health Act, which in 2003 updated informed consent law for the country for all services provided. And what that says is every healthcare provider must inform a user of the user's health status, the range of diagnostic procedures and treatment options generally available to the user, the benefits, risks, costs, and consequences, and the user's right to refuse. And it's really that diagnostic procedures and treatment options that are generally available. And this is not radical informed consent law. This is actually fairly typical informed consent law. There are two cases out of the South African Constitutional Court that we're highlighting here. HV Fetal Assessment Center sort of summarized where the law was on access to abortion in the country, and really dealt with the fact that it is medical malpractice and negligence, and that healthcare providers could be held liable if they fail to advise women of a fetal abnormality that's detected, as was the case in this particular situation, thus denying her an ability to make an informed choice about whether to continue the pregnancy. AB and another versus Minister of Social Development did not deal specifically with abortion, but did deal with assessing Section 12(2)A of the Constitution, and it set out a test by which you can assess whether conduct will violate Section 12(2) of the Constitution, and it's this three-part test. And we can apply this to the policy as we go. Does the impugned law or conduct prevent or inhibit a person or group of persons from making a decision? That is expressly the purpose of the policy, is to inhibit the ability to make the decision. If the answer to A is yes, does the decision concern reproduction? That is obvious. And then if the answer to B is yes, does preventing or inhibiting the decision detrimentally affect the psychological integrity of the person or persons concerned? I would also say the physical integrity of the person concerned. And we can also see that the answer to that would be yes. That's where we are with informed consent law. You would also look at ethical guidelines and what the ethical guidelines and whether healthcare providers could be subject to ethical complaints for failing to advise on all treatment options that are available. You would then need to also look at conscientious objection law and the provisions around conscientious objection and limitations on conscientious objection, specifically really assessing whether healthcare providers, what their duties are in the context of a conscientious objection, and whether organizational conscientious objection can flow down to healthcare providers. I'm just going to flag one set of regulations from Mozambique. So Mozambique, as people know, liberalized their abortion law upon request in 2014, and then in 2017, they published clinical guidelines that include these provisions, talking about the context of conscientious objection in relation to termination of pregnancy. And Section 1 there is really sort of the key, which is doctors and healthcare professionals who have a conscientious objection to termination of pregnancy are not forced to carry it out, except when there is a threat to the life of the woman or there is a severe threat to her health. And so you can't even conscientiously object to providing an abortion in the context where there is a threat to the woman's health. And then it also goes on to talk about the fact that you are required, if you take a conscientious objection, to refer to other providers who are not who do not conscientiously object to the provisions. And you can also see this in similar guidelines out of the Health Professions Council of South Africa or the South African Nursing Council. So assuming all of that applies, you end up in sort of a country and a location where it is likely that the policy or the affirmative defense would apply. We would advise organizations that receive U.S. Global Health Assistance funding to get formal legal advice on this. and to consider providing that formal legal advice to your USG managing agency. That's actually not necessarily required. And then instruct all healthcare workers that they must continue to counsel and refer for abortion services. If you had to say no to any of those sections, then you would look at what are the obligations that continue regardless. Healthcare workers, even those who have signed the policy, may and must continue to provide emergency contraception, can continue to counsel, refer, and provide in cases of rape, incest, or life endangerment, continue to provide post-abortion care services, and provide family planning and general contraceptive services. For organizations that are not bound by the policy or healthcare providers who are not bound by the policy, we would also suggest looking to your ethical regulatory bodies and assessing whether informed consent law can be modernized. And I just want to tie this all together in the context of dolutegravir. We've heard a lot about dolutegravir this week and the context around women having the right to choose whether to be on dolutegravir or efavirenz, and along with contraceptive services. But the WHO guidelines that were put out on Monday afternoon really talk about the requirement that care be provided in ways that respect women's autonomy in decision-making about their health. And services must provide information and options to enable women to make informed choices. Must provide information for women to make informed choices. That cannot be done in the context of the Mexico City policy. And this is a real conflict that both PEPFAR, the US government, and healthcare providers are really going to have to sort out, as these guidelines really do conflict with the policy itself. And we are continuing to press forward with dolutegravir rollout over the next 6 months to a year. So I'm going to leave it there. Once again, PLIGA does not affect the ability of organizations to provide emergency contraception. It does not affect the ability of organizations to provide post-abortion care, counsel, refer in instances of rape, incest, or life endangerment, or the passive referral, which is where an already pregnant woman says she wants to receive a legal abortion and just needs to know where to receive one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. I was really excited to say something very hopeful, about 2/3 of the way through your presentation. Informed consent still matters. That's so great. Then you get to dolutegravir. Well, that's a big conversation to continue during Q&A. I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Asa Andersson, who's the Senior Program Specialist at the Health Unit for Global Social Development, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you all, and thanks for coming and listening to our experiences on the impact of the USG the Mexico City policy on our partnership with sexual and reproductive health and HIV organizations. And we do have no conflict of interest to declare. So just a little bit background. You've heard it before, and you've seen these probably pictures before as well. So the U.S. administration, President Trump signed the Mexico City policy on the 23rd of January 2017. Just a few days later, our Deputy Prime Minister and our Minister for Development Cooperation and Climate Change, Isabella Lövin, signed a climate bill. Actually, it's nothing compared to it, but so this was quite vividly, circulated on social media. So she did this just a few days later, as I said, 2nd of February 2017. And a month later, Sweden joined the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium in launching the She Decides movement. It's a movement to increase mobilization of political forces throughout the world and increase financial support to sexual reproductive health and rights. And we allocated an additional funding of 22 million euros to our existing sexual reproductive health and HIV partners. And we did that because we think it was more than ever important to support organizations working on safe abortion when the financial support to these organizations are under threat. So what else did we do? Well, from that point, we also realized that we need to develop a position and guidance, and especially for our colleagues in the field to how they will relate to the Mexico City policy. And as you see below, these were the one on our website when our Director General of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, took this decision just a year back. It was on the 7th of July. And that for us was created quite an unexpected impact. You know, it was taken up in international media, etc. A lot of these reports were pretty much black and white, you know, that we should halt our funds, etc. It wasn't like that. It's a pragmatic policy, and it's a little bit more gray than that. But the reason for us to develop this was, as I said, it was to clarify and ensure that our position on sexual reproductive health and rights, where information and access to safe abortion is an integral part, is not compromised in our support to our partners if a partner then wants to comply to the Mexico City policy. We see that access to safe and legal abortion is key for gender equality and women's empowerment. You know, safe abortion services enable teenage girls to complete education, women to participate in labor force. So for us, it's the key for development of societies and countries. And Sweden has a long, long history of supporting sexual reproductive health and rights in our development cooperation. More than 50% of our health development cooperation budget goes to sexual reproductive health and rights. And out of the entire ODA budget, 70% of it goes to sexual reproductive health and rights, of the total sort of the 13-14% of it to health. So, as I said, this is not a new policy. This has always been in our support, and we develop a guidance just to help our colleagues at the country level. So if they had partners who said that they were most likely to comply with the Mexico City policy, then, you know, what would they do? Because in the most likelihood, they would not be able then to deliver on our results framework on when it comes to sexual reproductive health and rights. So in that case, we have to choose then to end the agreement. But this would then be based on a dialogue. It would be on a long-term you know, over time, and there is nothing that will be terminated automatically, and all agreements will be and have been so far looked at individually. But what to say is also, until today, none of our partners have complied with the Mexico City policy. And I think for us, it demonstrates that the partners we choose to work with stand up for and base the work on human rights, and they defend and support the whole sexual reproductive health and rights agenda. Also to note that during this whole process, we have had a very close dialogue with the U.S. government and USAID. And for them, it's, you know, it hasn't come to any surprise on our stand on this. You know, they know that we have a strong stand on sexual reproductive health and rights. And but as I said, we have a very open and transparent dialogue with them in this process on what we are doing. So just a little bit to what we also did after we took that decision on the position and guidance. So we did a review between August and September of 2017 to all our partners that are having any of sexual reproductive health and inclusive HIV in their partnership with us in the result frameworks. So we included 30 partnerships, and we looked especially at the agreements and the results framework, and then we discussed the Mexico City policy with them. So we had a set of 6 questions that we sent out. It may not have been totally standardized across, you know, how they brought it up, but the responses then were analyzed using descriptive statistics and qualitative thematic analysis, and we summarized them in 6 themes. Also to say that out of the 30 partners, 1/3 of them had ongoing USA Global Health Assistance Agreements. 2 of them, US-based NGOs, they indicated that they may comply with MCP. 6 foreign NGOs, they choose not to comply with MCP. 10 sub-grantees that received US global health assistant, were considering complying with MCP. And out of those, around 5 to 15%, majority had around 5 to 15%, but some of them even up to 60% of the budgets. So these are, of course, difficult choices that our partners have to make. Also, what we found, and these are first and foremost, the perceptions of our partner of the impact, and as many of my colleagues have alluded to in the previous discussion, it's a little bit too early to see the full impact. And for us, we only did this assessment just a few months after the policy had been put in place. But this is at least what they told us. They all felt that it was a threat to women's health and rights development, and that should, of course, be Agenda 2030. Sorry for that. But also the risk of discontinuation of health services. And I think there are definitely emerging evidence that this is happening from some of our partners that have been forced to close down clinics and reduce staff, etc. But also the risk of disintegration of services and fragmentation of health systems. CIDA has for long done a lot of work on how to integrate and provide a much more comprehensive sexual reproductive health and rights, including HIV services, etc. So this is something, and as you saw from our colleagues from the International HIV/AIDS Alliance, this is also what seems to be emerging in some of their research. Affecting the furthest one left behind, young people and especially young girls. What we heard also from earlier speakers, the shrinking space for SRHR organizations and a slowdown on normative work, the whole kind of chilling effect. Some of partners said they can't even go to meetings where they may bring up the MCP, etc. And also the organizational consequences for partners and for CIDA, and I'm just going to dwell a little bit more into those challenges. So for us, what we really experienced was a major confusion, especially then for organizations working mainly on HIV, as they earlier on had been exempted from this policy. So we had to do actually a lot of work in trying to explain this policy for them. Some of them had already signed, or some of the sub-grantors had already signed. What will that have to impact, etc. So a lot of information that was needed to go to organizations that earlier on hadn't really been exposed to this policy and didn't know. I think the challenges with sub-grantees are enormously, and it has been brought up as one of the first speaker, I think, and we can't agree more on that. And because our agreement is with the prime partner, so it's up to the prime partner then to ensure that they are delivering on our results and results frameworks. But for them, they are sub-granting in turn, and that's a lot of confusion. And also, I think for those sub-granters who are mainly smaller organizations, the major impact is on them and not really on the prime. So we're still trying to understand how we can in any way ease that burden. We also had a lot on concerns around, who is filling then the space if a partner needs to leave that space due to the non-compliances to Mexico City policy. And a lot of, we have also been sitting in a lot of discussion and received criticism for our strong standpoint on this. And we are aware, we are concerned that if it's true that there is so that the other organizations that have much more conservative and restrictive ways of delivering or trying to work on sexual reproductive health and rights, we need to definitely see how we can together with partners do something about that. We have also heard from the field that yes, from the ones that are moving in, they are still routing or allocating funds to more progressive American organizations. So the services as such are not affected. But then, if you look at the AIDS Effectiveness Agenda and the national ownerships, and there is a whole other bunch of other important questions. How do you build national ownership when we have to withdraw from the national organizations we are funding? So we are still unpacking that. We are concerned as everyone else, and we hope to find ways on working together to find a solution on this. But we also to say that a lot of partners have actually thanked us to become, to open this discussion with them and being much more active. So we see a lot of mobilization happening also, good for them. So, and what to say, the loss of funding, CEDA is not able, even, we can't compare to the US when it comes to the amount of funding, so there is no way that we will be able to fill those gaps, even we will try to do our best. Just a little bit on the future actions. So we will continue to provide our experiences into the US government. We did it for the last review. We're going to do it again in October. We have a lot of, a new set of questions for our partners. We are, as I said, we are continuing our support. We have even increased it, even more than the additional funds that we are receiving. We have a lot of other, in our support in bilateral, regional, and the global strategies. We are supporting studies to see and explore the impact of the Mexico City policy, and we are continuing our engagement in the political dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Asa. It's really important to get the new data from you, and also thank you for your support of ongoing data as well. Great news, everyone. It's audience participation time. Friday morning, time to get up and stretch. Ooh, no, it's afternoon. All right. Please come up to this microphone or that microphone or that microphone, and we will do questions in threes. We will start right here.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists, and I just want to applaud all the effort that's going into ensuring that our movements are working closely together in combating the impact of the global gag rule. My name is Katie Mayall. I work at the Center for Reproductive Rights. And I just wanted to add just two small points, just a bit of global or national level context around how we've seen the crackdown on civil society throughout a whole host of countries that are severely impacted by GGR, and also the importance of accountability at the national level for government's direct failure to ensure access to safe abortion care. So using Kenya as an example, the center has been litigating against the Kenyan government for their failure to ensure access to safe abortion and their intentional obstruction of access to safe abortion care. So I just want to add the important role there is in accountability at the national level as well. And also I apologize to everybody who's heard this plug 1,000 times before, the Center for Reproductive Rights is hosting a coalition of free legal services that we're providing to anybody who's confused about GGR implementation, who needs advice about what signing the gag rule would mean or does mean for your organization. So please just come find me. I have flyers and other information. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
Great. Thank you for the great panel. I enjoyed the presentations by Chloe and Jane. And my question, unfortunately, goes to the colleague from CEDA. We do appreciate that Sweden has been strong on gender and human rights, but is there any possibility of relooking at the decision that was taken to defund organizations that may have already signed the gag rule without their knowledge, without their intention? Because what we've seen on the ground is that many sex work organizations or many other key population organizations did not have the understanding. And the lady who just spoke talked about giving information around that. That was not available. Because at the end of the day, it becomes a challenge for us in small organizations to balance between, do you take PEPFAR money, do you take CEDA money, and if you don't take PEPFAR money, you mean you have to lay off people. So I'd really urge you to reasonably speak to the powers that be in CEDA to see whether that decision could be reconsidered or certain mitigation measures could be put in place to ensure that people don't lose access to certain key services in HIV just because of certain decisions made by other leaders. That's my plea. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll do one more here.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for the really fantastic presentations. My name is Pam Baats. I work for the Royal Tropical Institute here at KIDS in Amsterdam. And my question goes a bit in the direction of Jennifer. When doing this research on the implications of the Mexico City policy, also the element of technical assistance, I think, is also important to take into account. At KIDS, we had to pull out as sub-grantees out of 3 contracts. We had one with Gemonics on health system strengthening. We had one also with Pathfinder for Ethiopia, which was going to start on an innovative approach of improving client-patient relationships. And we had tested that approach elsewhere, and it really worked, and they really asked us to come on board, and we had to pull out. And the same went with AMREF, who also wanted to have that same kind of input for Kenya in Turkana in Samburu. As a knowledge institute, we could not bow to the Mexico City policy, so we had we really took a strong stand, and we pulled out. But I do think that because the research is very much looking at what is happening on the ground, but it's also about the quality of the services and the innovation, and that is then taking less place. And so I think it's very important to take that into account. And also towards Louisa, because that research was very much also focused on HIV and the HIV perspectives, but we all know that with HIV and SRHR, the integration is still lots to be left. And so also having then doing similar research on where sexual reproductive health and rights is much more on the forefront, because then there's a much wider perspective that needs to be looked at, and there must be many more implications. If you talk to countries like DRC, where contraceptive supplies are really being flown in much less, there is really big issues, and so the implications are much larger than I think what is being presented here. As you rightly say, it takes another 2-3 years to really know what the implications are, but I do think it's very important to look at it from a very broad stand. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are going to take some answers now, but please keep coming up to the microphone. So go to Katie for CRR for legal services, and then Asa, we'll start with you, and then go Jen and Louisa.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And I think that was what I tried to say, that we will have individual discussions with every partner, and to see how we can best solve the solutions. Our standpoint is that sexual reproductive health and rights, safe abortion is an integral part of it. And if you have an agreement with CEDA and on delivering on those result areas, you can't compromise on abortion in that program, etc. But we can definitely discuss each and every individual agreement, and we're happy to do so. So whoever the gentleman was who mentioned it, please approach us, and we will be happy to look into and see what we can do in order to ensure that even other critical services and life-saving services are still being able to be provided.
Thanks for the question. In our assessments, we have included technical assistance funding as a part of the funding that is implicated, and it's very clear in the policy that is part of the assistance, that any organization, any foreign NGO receiving funding for technical assistance would have to comply with this policy. So the number that we counted of prime recipients would include that. I think where it's harder to assess is how many, it sounds like you're a subrecipient, and so I'd actually be interested in talking with you more, because we are constantly being asked, do we know what organizations are making what decisions, and it's very hard to have that data. So, but yeah, I think your broader point is that there's impacts of actual services where we're talking about maybe HIV testing, counseling, potentially, and treatment, a range of services, but also information, technical assistance, other aspects of the whole service delivery system that are important to assess.
And Chloe, will you jump in?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add on to that. I think you also raise a point that's an sort of untold story of the gag rule and very difficult to measure, but is the people who are not competing for funds now because of the policy. And that is getting to the quality issue and the loss of the strength of sort of competitive, evidence-based process that our foreign assistance operates with. And we've heard from a number of partners who simply aren't going after funding now. But those stories are very, very hard to document. And I think that came out in what you were saying as well.
Thank you. And just, I think you raised great points. Just to respond briefly to that, I think the data that we're presenting here and looking at here is quite narrow in focus. It really hones in on that key population focus, and that's partly because the Alliance is well placed to do that as an organization who works with, particularly with key population organizations at the country level, and we're working, I think it's really important to mention, as I did at the beginning of my presentation, that we're working with a global working group of organizations that are doing research on the global gag rule, which is actually co-chaired by Bergen. And that coordination, I think, is really vital to this response. So we're really looking at kind of different ways in which different sectors and populations and countries are implicated or impacted. But we're also doing a number of other pieces of work at the organizational level, which includes doing a very broad mapping of all of our SRHR work across organizational partners, which is something we've done in the past, but it needs updating. And another piece that also speaks a little bit to my colleague from CRR's point is that there's no upside to the global gag rule, let me not be misinterpreted, but one of the things it's forced us to do as an organization is really to examine critically where we are when we talk about the delivery of a comprehensive SRHR package, what that means in reality, what it looks like on the ground, and how literate we are as an organization and a partnership when it comes to talking about abortion, safe abortion and post-abortion care. Because in a lot of the initial discussions I've had with our partners around the global gag rule, I've had a lot of responses like, well, abortion's illegal in this country, or, even post-abortion care is only accessible to certain groups of people. And so it's really, we've really begun to do some work, and we would love to work with CRR much more closely on this, in upping our game in how we're able to both support partners on the ground, but also speak to these issues and understand how they sit in the global HIV response and the whole area of HIV and SRHR integration, and be able to articulate that much, much more clearly and confidently. Yeah, so thank you.
Great. Thank you, Louisa, and thank you all for your questions. If you have a burning question but you're not standing at a microphone, I encourage you to come to the microphone now. This is going to be our last block of questions. And Louisa, thank you for mentioning the research group. If you are a researcher documenting impact of the policy and you are not involved in our group, please come see me. We'd love to have you involved. There is a lot of exciting data coming out over the next couple months and years. Abby, we'll start with you.
Good afternoon. My name is Abby from the Netherlands. I have a remark and a question. The remark is because it relates to Mozambique, because I'm quite familiar with the context there, and it adds to what we are currently not seeing in the research that we can do. And it is the fact, well, we are going steps back because of the implications of the gag rule, but what we are currently also not seeing is what could have happened if there was no gag rule. For example, in Mozambique, with the recent decriminalization of the laws around abortion, what should have been happening in Mozambique now is to advocate for implementation. Civil society is a very important partner to hold the government accountable for that implementation of the current law. And I know that there is civil society organizations there that are gagged and that therefore cannot do that advocacy that is so much needed. That was a remark, just to get us a little bit more depressed. I'm sorry about that. And my question is, I think mostly to Ms. Anderson, because I'm curious to know, in terms of our advocacy agenda, also to the US government. You mentioned it briefly, but I'm curious to know, because there seems to be a lot of legal base to contest the gag rule, because what the US government is currently doing is telling organizations what they can do with the funding that they receive from SIDA and other more progressive donors. So they are telling what can and cannot happen with your money. And then there is, of course, when you think about the freedom of speech and the whole human rights framework, there is so much, I think, legal base to address with the US government, and I really hope that donor countries as well as recipient countries can form a bloc to do that advocacy towards the US government. I know it is very difficult now, and that the Trump administration is not exactly vulnerable to being accused of violating human rights, but I'm just curious to find out more what is being done there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Two quick comments just to contribute to the conversation and see if the panel has any reaction. I may have missed this point earlier, but I just thought I would add out that combined with the timing of understanding the impact of the global gag rule, as the panel has pointed out, this coincides with a time frame under which Ambassador Birx has recently announced that PEPFAR wants to increasingly move to more local/indigenous organizations, targeting 70% of funding to go to those kinds of organizations by 2020. So at the very time when we will just be learning the impact of the global gag rule, more and more funding will actually apply to recipients in that category. So I think we could see an even prolonged period of time beyond 2020. As to the point that was made about the affirmative duty that may apply in certain countries, I wanted to share my experience at a PEPFAR implementing partner meeting that was held in South Africa earlier this year, where implementing partners were given guidance by PEPFAR itself, essentially stating that in South Africa, as it applied to South Africa's constitution and laws, that the affirmative duty only applied to South African health workers if they were proactive, if they were asked about abortion specifically, and that it did not apply to classroom education or any other opportunities to proactively offer information. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting your own independent legal opinion and sharing that with USAID or CDC to ultimately help influence that and make sure that kind of a full interpretation of how local laws might apply should be brought to bear, for a given partner. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We're going to go here, and then we'll go to our panelists.
Hello, I'm Liz Barker. I'm a member of the United Kingdom Parliament, and I'm a member of the All-Parliamentary Group on HIV/AIDS and chair of our All-Parliamentary Group on Sexual and Reproductive Health, hence my interest in this. I have 3 points. First of all, this is the reiteration of a policy that has been implemented by various different US administrations. The research does not need to start from zero. We all have already seen this in different forms. Can the research be fast-tracked because we know roughly what we're looking for and where it's going to go? Secondly, in the light of that, particularly since we've had this policy in various guises before, can work and energy be put into workarounds that will help people to sustain some of their services until the happy day when this current administration is no more? And thirdly, as a parliamentarian in a country which is a major funder, a major donor, I stand up every couple of weeks in our parliament and ask for yet another commitment from the UK government that we will take into account this rule and we will work with enlightened partners to mitigate it. What I would ask is whether between those whether it is possible for those who are involved in the field to help us to distinguish that which is acceptable to the US administration and that which is not, so that we can have some moving around of funds where enlightened and sympathetic donors have the wherewithal to do that, even if that's only for the current period of Gilead until that's at an end.
Thank you. And our last question?
Yep, and hopefully it'll be a quick question. But thank you to all the panelists, and this is directly to Brian, and maybe I missed it. But can you please clarify, particularly around the waivers, and at least it's my understanding that the waiver has to be granted by the U.S. government. An organization can't decide that they've issued themselves a waiver and it doesn't apply. So can you just clarify sort of that waiver process and what that means? Because I wouldn't want organizations to look at something and think, oh, this doesn't apply to us, only to find out that it does later and they get themselves into trouble. So if you could clarify that, that'd be great.
Great, thank you all. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to start down with Asa, and we're going to move down all the way and end with Jen. Every panelist can jump in. We are running low on time, so be a bit succinct with your answers. And for our parliamentary friend, I'm taking the moderator's role and jumping in here. The fast-tracking research, I do want to note for everyone that the Ben David study that Chloe mentioned, there is a researcher who has replicated that methodology and applied it globally. Yana Rogers has a new book coming out on global gag with updated data. It'll be released in October, so do keep an eye out for that. Issa, I'm going to hand it down to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the questions, and thanks for the idea. Of course, we can also look at it from the legal perspective. I don't think we have done it, but we do a lot of advocacy, not only from CEDA's perspective, but also from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we have engaged in conversations and dialogue with the USG and also with like-minded partners, seeing what we can do together, etc. So there is a lot of things going on, both within the ministry and sort of through the diplomatic channels, as well as from us, from the CEDA department as well, and trying to see how we can mitigate it. And as a parliamentarian, we have also a similar committee in our parliament, and they have strong, such a strong support from home on this. So I think, we have all the right to be vocal and open about it, and we will continue to and remain to be a strong partner together with the rest of you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for the questions. I want to go to first, just on the point made about Mozambique. I think this is an incredibly important part about sovereignty. Countries have made these laws more liberal for reasons, because they believe they are essential health services. And the fact of the matter is, not only is this interfering with relationships between funders like CEDA, but it's also interrupting relationships between national governments and organizations that work for national governments and do work for national governments. So because of the expansion and the reach of PEPFAR into a lot of these indigenous and some of the most effective indigenous organizations at providing healthcare services, they're being cut off from being able to do work for their own national government because the national government is asking them to do work and information about making women more informed, particularly in Mozambique, about the fact that the laws have been changed and that abortion is now available. On the South Africa training, they were wrong, and you should take that message back, is my hope. And then on the way, but I think the point on that is even U.S. government officials do not understand this policy and do not understand the legal environment in which this policy applies. Just lastly, on the waivers are actually a completely different process. That was something that was said in the expansion of the policy, that case-by-case case-by-case assessments would be done for organizations that sought to be exempted from the policy, and that exemption could be applied for to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State has changed since that time. But also we have not heard of any organization getting any response to applying for a waiver. The affirmative defense is completely different. It is part of the policy, so it is not a conflict with the policy. It is part of the policy. So if you are in a legal environment where informed consent is robust, it is not a conflict with the policy, and you don't need a waiver.
I'm just going to speak very briefly to the question around workarounds. I am aware of instances of workarounds having been found. I'm not going to go into details, but I'm happy to have a conversation after the session. The one thing I would say about that is that at least in the situations that I'm aware of where it's great to have found the possibility of continuing to do work, it has also added, an administrative or bureaucratic burden that's, so it's better than nothing, but not ideal also.
Yeah, and I want to just reiterate a point. I think when you talk about the research and how long, I think there's questions about how long it'll be till we can say the impact. I think part of the reason we're all talking about the impact is that seems to be on everyone's mind when we talk about how harmful is this policy. And I just want to underscore that I don't think we need to wait for all the data to be there to take the steps to reverse what we know will be the outcome to the point you've made. We know from the past the harmful effects it's had. And, to quote actually a friend from AMFAR sitting right here, there's no mixed data on this issue. We may not know all the effects of the policy, but everything we do know is that it's harmful. So I do think it's a call to action for us, and we need to push back on asks that we have to know everything before we take steps to reverse the effects it's having. I just want to quickly comment on the advocacy questions and steps. The challenges to the policy, I think, it's a bit of a tricky landscape, and unfortunately the U.S. Legal landscape doesn't present a ton of options for dealing with it. That said, there is legislation that would permanently repeal the policy that currently has 200 members of Congress across the House and Senate supporting it, including, I will add, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who is right next door talking and getting lots of applause. So there is a real support. It's bipartisan as well. I think the prospects of that passing in this current climate with this Congress and the president's ability to veto legislation are low, but the importance of using this time to really build the case is really vital. So I think the fight we're doing is so critical. And then just to add to the point about really to thank our member of parliament here from the United Kingdom, everyone does have a role. And I think, we talk about workarounds, we need to make sure we're not over-implementing the policy. So we have to fight it at every stage. We need to make sure that the climate the policy creates isn't creating new national restrictions to sexual and reproductive health and rights, which we are seeing happening in other governments. So at every stage, I think we do have a role to be fighting its effects, even while the prospect of getting it completely reversed is maybe not imminent, but, we'll still try.
Great. I'll make just two brief comments. One is there was a lot of anticipation or expectation that this policy would be reinstated. So for those working in the family planning community, I think there were, from my understanding, there's a lot of conversation and prep work already in place in that community that was very familiar with it. What wasn't expected was the expansion. So it brought in a whole new set of NGOs, of actors, of civil society groups that really had to familiarize themselves with what this meant and try to understand it. So that did add a real change. The other thing that we didn't talk about, and just something to think about, is when the policy was last in place, it was ended in 2008, or maybe technically the beginning of 2009, but there was a different environment for PEPFAR and a different environment for family planning, and a lot has changed in that decade. And one of the things that changed was there was a growing discussion and movement towards integrating HIV and family planning services, and a recognition that the data support doing that, and it's better for women, it's better for people at risk. And so the very sort of trajectory of the field really moved in one direction, and now this new policy has come in place. So I think that the conditions are different as well. So it's just something to think about as we all try to assess what the implications are. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists and our co-sponsors for Bound and Gagged. I didn't get to say the name of this panel enough, Bound and Gagged. I just like saying it. So applause for all of our panelists, and thank you all.